Welcome everybody to today's event, organized by Correlate Netherlands, which is a non-profit organization that connects data scientists with organizations that advance the social good. We have about 250 data scientists in our Dutch network and over 1,000 abroad. And you can learn more about us by visiting our website at correlate.nl. But without further advertisement to tonight's event, I'm very excited to introduce George Kamiya, who is an energy policy analyst at the International Energy Agency, where he coordinates work on digitalization and tracking clean energy progress. He also leads the IEA's analysis of the energy use of information and communication technologies and new mobility. And he was the lead author of the 2017 report on digitalization and energy and has contributed to the agency's work on climate change, electricity security, and critical minerals. And tonight he'll talk about digitalization, energy, and climate change for I think about 30 to 40 minutes, after which there'll be enough time for discussion. So George, thanks again for joining us, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Fabian, and great to be here and talk to all of you. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So hopefully my slides will stimulate some ideas and thoughts and reactions, and we can go through an interesting Q&A after. I've shared my screen. Are you able to see the slides? Perfect. So yeah, so thanks again. I'll try to get through this in about half an hour, kind of providing an overview of how I see how we see digitalization impacting energy systems, and then in turn how that affects climate change. So I think it's worth first talking about where we are in terms of our emissions. So here's a snapshot, historical snapshot of greenhouse gas emissions, energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, rising very rapidly, especially over the past few decades. Last year, 2020, because of the COVID crisis, we saw a 6% drop in greenhouse gas emissions from energy systems. Of course, coming at incredible cost to human life and economy and societies. So the daunting challenge ahead for us as we look at decarbonizing energy and the globe at large is that we have to decarbonize the system at this kind of rate over the next coming decades. So if we reach net zero by 2050, that's about 1.5 degrees of warming. To reach net zero by 2070, that's about 1.7 degrees of warming. And there are a number of technologies, policies, pathways that are still possible to reach these pathways. But the alarming news is that for 2021, we are actually on track for a rebound in greenhouse gas emissions. So we've seen this kind of rebound after other previous drops in greenhouse gas emissions. And it's really 2020 and 2021 is really a turning point, I think, a once in a generation opportunity for us, for governments, for companies to invest in the clean energy technologies that we need for the next decade, for the coming decades, to get us on one of these greener paths and not to return to pre-COVID levels of greenhouse gas emissions and potentially increasing emissions, which would cause devastating impacts across the world. So that's a bit of context on the challenge ahead. First, we need to understand where emissions are coming from. So energy systems, energy and industrial processes account for the bulk of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the rest, about 80%, and the rest come from agriculture and land use, waste, other sectors. So to reach our global climate goals, we really need to decarbonize the energy system. And what is that? It includes power generation. So that's coal-fired power, natural gas-fired power, small segment of oil, heavy industries, manufacturing, how we use energy in buildings. So if you think about your house, how it's heated, how it's electrified, and then commercial buildings, offices, data centers, for example, transportation, everything from passenger cars, aviation, shipping, rail, all of these use energy and typically emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, there's fossil fuel production as well in the other category. So the task ahead to decarbonize all of this to get to net zero by 2050 is quite daunting. And we need all the right clean energy technologies, all the digital technologies, I think, to help us decarbonize all of these. So so when we talk about digital technologies in the ICT sector, there's obviously a direct footprint. So the data centers, data networks, devices that we rely on, the energy used to power them, as well as manufacture them. There is a direct effect on other sectors. So if you think about how smartphones and GPS have enabled new services like Uber and Lyft, that has effects on the transportation system. And in turn, some of those services also have secondary effects. For example, how people make other modal choices, whether they're using public transport or private transport, shared mobility. And that, in the longer run has effects on how the cities are built and how people are planning to, buy homes or rent homes in different areas of the city or outside the city. So first, I'll talk about the footprint side. So just to recap, the ICT sector typically includes the data centers, the data transmission networks, and then the devices that we all use. Um, One thing about the digital technology system is that any indicator related to economy or electricity energy is typically increasing, but not at the rate that we've seen digital technologies. So the number of internet users has increased by 10 times over the past 2 decades. Internet traffic has grown by more than 2,000 times. So just proportionally speaking, compared to other economic and energy indicators, these are very rapid rates of change. So, it's natural that we see headlines like this. This is one from 1999, actually, in the United States from Forbes, uh, projecting that half the US electric grid would be used to power the internet over the coming decades. So that would be by 2010, half the US electric grid. Obviously, that didn't happen, but this rapid growth causes these kind of alarming headlines that we continue to see. In reality, data center energy use has been relatively flat over the past decade, increasing only a few percentage points. It accounts for about 1% of global electricity use overall. And this is despite a huge surge in internet traffic since 2010. It's a growth of over 12 times. Data center workloads, so demand for data center services growing by more than 7.5 times. And there's really two main drivers for this. So on the graph on the right, you can see a huge shift in energy use and services, of course, from traditional corporate, less efficient, decentralized data centers, enterprise data centers, towards cloud and hyperscale data centers, which tend to have much higher utilization, much more efficient computing and storage and cooling as well. So this has been a major contributor to efficiency improvements and helping to keep energy demand flat over the past decade. The other is improving efficiency at the compute level and, of course, storage and networking. On the left, that's a graph showing Kumi's law, which is energy efficiency of peak output efficiency, doubling every 2 to 3 years. It's slowed down in recent years. And then on the right, data transmission efficiency, also doubling every 2 to 3 years, especially in well-developed networks in developed economies. So there's kind of this macro level shift from less efficient to more efficient data centers, and then there's a more micro level improvement in efficiency at the compute level. So there's a lot of efforts to reduce the energy needed through efficiency measures. And then of the remaining energy needs, there's also been a strong push by the sector to procure as much renewable energy as possible. And this makes sense from a business perspective as well, given the bulk of if you look at data center, the bulk of their costs are going to come from energy use. Renewables are increasingly becoming the cheapest sources of renewable electricity in most grids. PPAs can lock in a low price for a long amount of time. So there's also interest in these companies to become greener as well. So ICT companies as a whole, as a sector, have accounted for about half of global corporate renewable purchase agreements in the past 5 years. You see, Amazon announcing deals. I think last week. I think one thing worth pointing out here is that companies like Google, Apple, they've reached 100% renewable electricity for their companies, What that means is that they are buying enough renewable energy through these corporate purchase of power agreements, some on-site generation, to match the amount of electricity that they're using in data centers globally. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a wind farm immediately beside their data centers at every location providing clean electricity 24/7. So now these companies are actually talking about how do you meet um, green electricity on a 24/7 basis. So here is an image from Google looking at their data center operations across the world. You can see in some regions like Oklahoma, uh, partly because of the grid and partly because of their power purchase agreements, 96% of their electricity is green on a 24/7 basis. But if you look at Singapore, most of that grid, the broader grid, is quite not fired by natural gas. So they would need to think about other ways to try to decarbonize the supply there. So either pushing policymakers to develop more renewable power projects, they could purchase renewable PPAs themselves, shifting workloads across regions, for example. There's been increasing discussions around that. And of course, shifting workloads across time. So if there is a flexible workload that is, that is not time important, uh, perhaps those, for example, indexing Google Photos or something, those could be perhaps done overnight at a specific data center, which has, a lot of excess wind in that grid. So these companies are thinking more and more about how do you actually achieve zero carbon electricity all the time. These companies also have a lot of resources, and I think they should be at the cutting edge of trying to invest in emerging clean energy technologies like battery storage, green hydrogen, CCUS and direct air capture, advanced nuclear. These technologies that are still in its early stages, but looking at the broader energy system, these are technologies that we are going to need in the coming decades. So if these companies can invest and pilot these projects, perhaps in the data center sector, maybe it's not going to be the game-changing technology, but in other hard-to-abate sectors, they will become increasingly important when we look at decarbonizing the entire energy system. We've talked mostly here about the use phase environmental impacts. So the power, basically the electricity used to power the data centers, the devices, the networks. Of course, there are impacts throughout the life cycle of any product. So starting from raw materials extraction to manufacturing that device or hardware, distributing it across the globe in supply chains in the use phase, and then of course, end of life, recycling or disposal. And on the graph on the right, you can see that different types of devices and user devices have different shares of environmental impacts that are embodied, which is the manufacturing materials versus the energy consumption during the lifetime. So if you look at a large screen device like a television, which tends to be less energy efficient than, for example, a smartphone, most of the carbon emissions associated with that product are going to come from the use phase. So energy efficiency standards are extremely important in this context, especially if you are operating that device in a high carbon grid. The smaller the screen and the smaller the device, especially as it becomes portable, obviously there's going to be a huge consumer interest in having that device be as efficient as possible so that the battery life is longer. So you see that, tablet, smartphone, most of the impacts in the life cycle of that product are actually going to come from the embodied emissions. So the raw materials and manufacturing stages. So of course, we also need to think about environmental impacts beyond energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, there's going to be impacts on soil, air, water, biodiversity, and electronic waste. And we need to think about all of these as we try to minimize the environmental impacts of ICT. Looking ahead, you may have seen headlines like this one from The Guardian, claiming that a tsunami of data could consume a fifth of global electricity by 2025. This kind of number originates from a 2015 study by Andre and Edler, and particularly their worst case scenario. So since then, actually, Andre has published multiple studies that have actually shown much lower numbers into the future as well as present. So here's a spread of all these studies. These studies are of different qualities, different data, different assumptions, different base years. So there is a huge challenge in this sector because of a lack of data collection and data availability, that we don't have concrete numbers both for present. We have a rough range, and then into the future, it becomes increasingly uncertain. So here are some current numbers. This is global data center energy use in 2019. You can see Andre's study. The numbers have come down since his original 2015 study. The SHIFT project, which used modeling from Andre, has also equally decreased their assumptions, estimates recently. The Belkier study, Belkier and Megli in the middle, which is quite high. They took 5 years of data, in the I think early 2000s, and extrapolated that into the future. So, that doesn't really capture the efficiency improvements that we've seen in the sector. So, the likely range is probably in this kind of this banded area, 200 to 270 terawatt hours, which is about 1%. Global electricity use today is about 24,000 terawatt hours. So we're talking in the order of 1% of electricity use for data centers, and then another 1.5% of electricity use for data networks. Of course, that's electricity. There's other energy use, for example, from direct fuel combustion in vehicles and other transport services. The future is extremely uncertain in the sector. So if we look just back at the last decade, we've seen the emergence of smartphones, new mobile networks, 4G, streaming video and gaming is becoming an increasingly important part of the sector. But on the other hand, we've seen a lot of energy efficiency improvements, and I mentioned electricity decarbonization, not just the direct power purchase agreements of these companies, but importantly, countries as well decarbonizing rapidly. So if you look at the UK, over the past decade, I think they've halved their energy or electricity carbon intensity, which is an impressive feat. And more countries are decarbonizing their electricity grids rapidly as they phase out coal and gas and increasingly bring in renewables. Looking into the future, we see emerging technologies like blockchain, machine learning, IoT, 5G, AR and VR, and how I think these affect energy use into the future and carbon emissions is very uncertain. So these will drive direct demands for these services, but also these technologies will also work in tandem to enable new applications that we aren't even yet aware of. So if you think about the combination of 5G and IoT and AI, ML, machine vision, these could give to the rise of autonomous vehicles, fully autonomous vehicles, which have I'll talk about later in this presentation, energy impacts in the transport system, which are much likely to be much larger than the direct footprint of any one of these technologies. And of course, on the reducing energy use side, there needs to be strong investments into new efficient technologies because it's quite plausible that using current technologies, we will run out of efficiency opportunities in the coming decades. So there needs to be both. We can't simply rely on past efficiency improvements, that they will continue into the future. A couple of these emerging technology examples. So Bitcoin mining, probably seen these kind of headlines saying, so Bitcoin is currently consuming, I think it's dropped since China mining rigs have taken offline the past few weeks, but roughly 0.4 to 0.6% of global electricity use, which is quite comparable to data centers. So, if it's about 100 terawatt hours a year, that's a half of compared to all other data centers. So data centers, I mentioned about 200, 250 terawatt hours, and Bitcoin outside of that. And so that's 220, 250 excluding Bitcoin. It's a huge number, and it's grown from virtually zero 5 or 6 years ago. So, and this is despite, if you see on the graph on the right, huge efficiency improvements in terms of the mining hardware. So it's kind of an arms race as it becomes more and more profitable for miners, and they're deploying faster and faster equipment and more powerful equipment. The energy use is just skyrocketing. So it's hard to predict where this is going to go. Generally, the energy use trends have been tracking prices. So if we continue to see prices rise, it's very plausible that we will see energy consumption also increase. But this is not a criticism of blockchain in general. There are other ways of like proof of stake, proof of authority, It doesn't mean that we need to do proof of work, energy intensive algorithms for every application of blockchain. And I think often the discussion becomes, oh, blockchain is Bitcoin, but certainly not. And there are promising uses of blockchain throughout the energy system to transact and to reduce energy use and improve efficiencies. Another headline you might have seen is around AI models and emitting carbon. This is specific to training AI models, the paper from 2 years ago. There are more and more, so this paper created a lot of interest, and I think more researchers or more ML researchers and practitioners are interested in this topic, which is great. I've seen more and more calculators start to emerge. So here's 3 of them, where they look at the hardware type, the number of hours of training, who's providing that service, and the region, because that, of course, has a very important impact on the carbon intensity of that data center service. So it's great to see increasing interest in this, especially from practitioners who can, for example, like I mentioned, shift their workloads if it's not time sensitive to times of the day when it's likely to have more renewable energy. Of course, training is just one part of the ML model lifecycle. It's very hard right now, without a lack of data, to understand what is the complete or total footprint of ML for energy use and emissions. So, of course, training happens less frequently than inference, but of course, each inference is going to be much less carbon intensive, energy intensive than training or development. So this combination of energy per run versus the frequency would give rise to the total AI-related carbon footprint, which is probably on the order of 0.1 to 0.2% of global carbon emissions today, given it's a slice of the ICT sector, which itself is only about 1.5% of global GHGs. The challenge ahead for ML is that demand is increasing very, very rapidly. So here is data from Facebook on the left, where they show that demand for inference in their servers is more than doubling every year. Compute demand for training is increasing even faster, plus 150% per year. Meanwhile, their data center energy use has been growing about 40% a year. So there's clearly some efficiency improvements that they are doing in-house. Of course, we don't know what other service these data centers are providing, but I think it's an interesting snapshot into what kind of growth we might anticipate, and how is there potential to decouple the increased demand with increased energy use. Another area that has been receiving increasing attention is around streaming video, because it accounts for a dominant share of global network traffic. This headline and other headlines from 2019 said that half-hour show emits 1.6 kilograms of CO2, the equivalent of driving 4 miles, which sounds like a lot. So it seemed implausible to me, and I wrote up a fact check on this. So I did an original analysis in February of last year, coming out with a number about 82 grams per hour instead. So instead of 3.2 kilograms per hour, the earlier number was for half an hour. And then I've updated that analysis since. Now my number is about 40 grams, 30 to 40 grams. Of course, it really depends on the grid that you are operating in. So if your grid is largely decarbonized, relying on hydro or renewables and nuclear, like in France, it's going to be a very, very low, or Norway, very low emissions. In Australia, which is still dominated by coal, you're still going to get some emissions, but it's definitely not in the order of driving any long distance. So it's instead comparable to boiling a kettle once or twice, I would say. So not too much to worry about, but of course the use is going up rapidly. So here's some of the breakdowns of electricity use between the 3 segments we talked about earlier. There is data centers, which my analysis shows is a very small segment, data transmission, and then devices actually, I think, account for the largest share. I'll just go quickly through this. So some of the problems that I've seen with these estimates is that they use outdated assumptions, which tend to result in very high estimates for current energy use. The other being that assuming that data is proportional to energy. So there's been headlines saying if you switch from HD to SD, it would cut your energy use, but of course, internet infrastructure doesn't work that way. So for example, turning off your video, most of your environmental impact from this Zoom call is actually coming from your laptop. If you turn off your video, of course, it's going to be using less electricity for the device. But in terms of the network and data centers, it's not as big as 96%. Because if that were true, during COVID-19, we saw huge increases in network traffic, upwards of 40 to 50%. But in reality, network operators report that their energy use has actually been quite flat. And we're now starting to see real world data around this. So Telefonica, one of the largest network operators in the world, reports that their traffic increased by 40%, 45% last year, but their energy use was down 1.4%, and carbon emissions even faster. Another is limited scope. Sometimes they exclude parts of the system that are actually important. So some of these studies either underestimated the device side. Shift project, for example, assumed that watching was split between laptops and smartphones, but clearly there's a shift towards televisions, especially for Netflix and Amazon Prime. YouTube, of course, is going to be more mobile friendly. This is kind of a summary of my analysis showing that the device plays a huge role. So if you want to reduce the impact, it's better to stream on a energy efficient device. Or of course, if you're watching on a large screen, to share that service with more people. The other is a lack of context or counterfactual. So you might, there's another headline about streaming music being dangerous, but what is this compared to? Because obviously streaming, a track on your phone is very energy efficient compared to buying a CD or a record and shipping it across the world and using a dedicated device, a CD player or something that's going to consume 10, 20 watts of electricity. So it really compares, it's important to compare to what. Another one about emails. I find these headlines quite distracting in terms of the overall climate challenge, because it confuses, I think, regular citizens into figuring out, what actions would have the biggest impact in terms of their emissions. Obviously, cutting emails is going to have a very small impact in this. So, it's very challenging to assess the net impacts at the systems level. It's difficult to compare digital technologies and services to their baseline. So do we compare emails to physical letters or phone calls? Streaming video, what is the best counterfactual? If it didn't exist, what would we be doing? Bitcoin as well, we've seen comparisons with gold or banking systems on a transaction level. And then there are difficulties in quantifying rebound effects and system-wide effects. So streaming video, for example, there's autoplay functions, and people are much more likely to binge watch and watch more because it's so easy and it's a fixed cost than if they had to rent a DVD. So there are these interactions which I'll get into now. So I would argue, the digital footprint, the direct footprint is manageable. The demand is growing rapidly, but I think the biggest effects that these technologies are going to have are on the other sectors. So I'll use a couple examples to illustrate this. For teleworking, the ICT energy use is roughly the same, whether at home or the office, but the biggest changes are going to come from increased energy use in your home, because now you are going to be heating or cooling your home when you were previously in the office. But obviously that's going to be offset by your commuting energy savings. So if you were driving to work previously, that's going to be a huge energy and carbon savings. If you were biking or walking, that's going to be very, very close to zero, and you're going to actually probably be increasing your energy use because you're working from home. Commercial buildings, office buildings, this is going to depend on the frequency of your working from home situation. If offices are able to shut down, then of course that's going to result in savings. But if half of your office is still going in, the HVAC systems, lighting, internet infrastructure is still all going to be running. So I think for teleworking, the interesting side is the long-term effects. So around urban sprawl, and whether if people are able to work from home all the time, would they be more likely to leave cities? And would that mean they would likely live in larger homes, adopt different consumer habits? So, for example, would they, the larger home obviously would require more energy and emissions, but would that also mean they would choose to buy a car if they previously didn't have them because now they're in the suburbs? For e-commerce, similarly, the ICT impact is quite small. The biggest impacts are going to come from last mile delivery, which is offset by, of course, consumer transport that you no longer have to go to the store. But there are packaging costs, energy use and materials, and warehousing costs, offset by retail stores that are shutting down. But these have impacts beyond energy use and emissions. Obviously, employment, the types of jobs, the types of interactions we have in our communities. And then longer term, does the ease of e-commerce make it more likely that we purchase more purchase things that we don't need? Or can we use those digital tools to make more eco-information available and connect people to reuse and resell items? So this is just kind of a reminder that there's kind of push and pull on both sides. So we can have policies that minimize the direct footprint of the technologies, and we need positive policies to limit the rebound effects and to encourage the use of these technologies in the right places. So in the energy sector, we wrote a report a couple of years ago on how digital technologies can be applied. So in buildings, these are things like smart building controls, smart thermostats, connected appliances, and lighting, basically to optimize demand with clean electricity supply, and also improve efficiency at the device level. In industry, looked at robotics, digital twins, 3D printing, and ML. Here's a 3D printing example. So if we can switch to additive manufacturing components in aviation, for example, we can drastically reduce the amount of metals that we need in the coming decades, which results also in use phase fuel savings. So because the 3D printed parts are going to be lighter and smaller, we can actually reduce the weight of the aircraft and save fuel during the transport stage. In transportation, we looked at shared mobility services, automated connected vehicles, and freight optimization. So here, I think, is another example where we need to be looking at different levels of the system interacting. So at the vehicle level, what is the efficiency impact? At the transportation and urban levels, what is that going to impact in terms of user behavior, congestion, travel costs, and then societally, what does that result in terms of a behavioral shift between modes and energy use? In terms of the example of connected automated vehicles, this is a paper from, I think, 2017, looking at different futures of automated and collective vehicles in terms of their energy use and carbon emissions. So in a very optimistic scenario where all these vehicles are shared, electric, we can still have increased travel demand because it's going to be cheap. We can decrease energy intensity because they're going to be eco-driven, automated. And also, we can fit more people in the same cars. Instead of single occupancy cars, we can share them and optimize them through the system, and we can decrease energy use overall. But in a worst case scenario, we can more than double energy use because now the cost is so cheap and people are going to be using it for everything. So instead of taking public transit to work, people might be using their automated cars to commute even longer distances. And kind of relating back to the teleworking example, there's a plausible picture where people live further from cities now because the combination of teleworking plus the fact that maybe they can commute in an automated car and work while they go to work for 2 hours. Maybe that's no longer an issue anymore. So it's the future of automated vehicles is really going to depend on how people adopt these technologies, the technologies themselves, and how policy can shape the future of their uses in energy and carbon emissions. In the electricity system, we're already seeing the use of IoT and automation improve efficiency and reduce maintenance costs. Machine learning to improve solar and wind forecasts. So here's a chart from DeepMind using their ML to predict 36 hours in advance the output from a wind farm, which does remarkably well. And that can help in both for that wind farm as well, but more for the overall system. So if you are able to better predict output and match that with demand. So for example, if you have EVs charging at a certain hour and you can forecast the wind availability, you can match those two to reduce the carbon emissions. Which is kind of how we're changing the electricity system. So historically, we've had very large power plants, thermal or renewables, feeding one way into end users in industry and buildings. Now we are seeing a much more interconnected, digitally enabled, integrated energy system that connects all of these in two-way flows instead. What does that mean? So 3 opportunities from digitalization here. So deep demand response, which is basically shifting demand to different times of the day that have beneficial impacts on the grid. EV charging, so whether we adopt dumb charging, basically plugging in and then it charges right away, or if we can even shift the time of charging to, for example, when there's a lot of wind available overnight, in a semi-smart way, or even in the future, a vehicle-to-grid system where you feed it back and forth. Maybe the battery in the car can provide grid services for when there's less available renewable electricity supply. So just to illustrate what that means, here's a electricity grid profile over 48 hours. If we add uncontrolled demand, so think about EVs or heating or cooling, that just adds to the peaks. But if we are able to optimize that demand profile, we can significantly flatten that peak and also match the supply or match the demand to renewable energy supply. So you see on the left, use coincident with PV output, maybe midday. Now you try to match a certain end use with the PV output. I already mentioned this before, but the challenge in assessing the baseline of hypothetical scenarios. So, what do we compare it to, and what is the counterfactual of a situation where this technology didn't exist? Obviously, these are all cumulative, so it's very challenging to say that the ICT sector can contribute to X amount of carbon emission reductions over a certain time, because it's very hard to isolate that particular service. Another interesting example is in oil and gas. There's been a lot of interesting articles in the last year about detecting methane leaks. So here's our chart. This is, methane emissions continue to rise slowly. These are huge sources of greenhouse gas emissions, especially from the energy system. So these are leaky pipes, methane that's being leaked from oil and gas resources. And we need to drastically reduce this to meet our sustainability goals. So currently, methane emissions are comparable to total energy-related CO2 emissions of the European Union. So a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we need to cut. So it's incredibly challenging to detect where the leaks are happening. So here's an interesting example where street view cars have been outfitted with methane sensors, so to detect leaks in the city distribution system. I think it's quite interesting as ML is being now applied to detect leaks. So using different sensor inputs. On the left, researchers out of US energy labs have come up with an ML model to improve detection of leaks. On the right, kind of an emerging paper looking at how ML can reduce the cost of mitigation and improve how quickly they can detect leaks. So I think they said that the top 5% of wells are like super emitters. So if they could detect those as quickly as possible, they account for the bulk of methane emissions. That would go a huge way in terms of reducing overall methane emissions. Energy access. In sub-Saharan Africa, where hundreds of millions of people still don't have access to electricity. There are increasingly mobile phone services linked to infrastructure that facilitate electricity access. In terms of policy, I think this is kind of still early stages, but obviously there's a huge potential for digital technologies to improve data collection, modeling, assessing options, compliance and enforcement. So policymakers, I think, should definitely be using these technologies as well. Maybe the biggest point I'd like to make here is that the net impacts of energy use and emissions will be shaped by climate policy. So what I mean is, not all applications of these technologies is going to be climate positive. So the automated vehicles example, there's a potential for huge rebounds and increased energy use and emissions. Similarly, in oil and gas, we might actually use technologies to decrease the costs of extraction and make them more competitive against renewables and other clean energy technologies. Electricity, we might see IoT and automation improve efficiency of coal-fired power plants and extend their lifetimes. So we need the right climate policy frameworks to encourage the use of these technologies in the right places. A couple final points to wrap up. Energy systems are huge infrastructures and they have a long lifetime. So it's not like digital infrastructures where the software and hardware cycles are months to years. These are power plants that are built for 40, 50-year lifetimes. So we need to stop investing in polluting infrastructures today, because a new coal-fired power plant in Southeast Asia that's built today is going to be around in 2050, and it's going to be very hard to decarbonize that unless we completely phase it out. The other point worth highlighting is that we also need huge boosts in innovation. There's other very hard to abate sectors like heavy industry and long distance transport, where many of the technologies that we need to get into net zero are still in early prototype or demonstration phases. So, in electricity, we have renewables, we have all those technologies, we just need to scale up. In some of these hard to abate sectors, these are very early technologies that we need to invest in a lot of innovation. So just a few points to wrap up. So I think there's been a lot of incredible progress on reducing the footprint of digital technologies, but obviously those demands are going to continue to go up over the next decade. So we need to continue to invest in efficiency, renewables, and obviously decarbonizing supply chains as the embodied emissions share increases. I would say the effects on other sectors are much, much bigger, and I think these deserve as much, if not more, policy attention. But these effects obviously are very difficult to quantify. And like I said, I think I'd like to highlight again, digital technologies are climate agnostic. These are not silver bullets to get us on a climate net zero path. Some are going to help to reduce emissions, obviously, because they go in tandem with cost reductions. But there may be uses that increase emissions, either directly or indirectly, and we need the strong climate policies to make sure that these are aligned with our long-term climate goals. So I've included some readings and links. I'll happy to share these slides after, as there's a lot of papers that I've cited. But yeah, happy to take questions. And sorry if I went over time.
Thank you so much, George. This is really insightful and wide-ranging talk. And it's going to be a challenge to decarbonize this complex system we call society. I would give it up for questions. So you can raise your hands or type it in the chat. Otherwise, just take your time. Maybe I start us off. You mentioned when you talked about the sort of the carbon footprint of devices, and the TV basically, mostly in terms of the energy it uses, and smaller devices are sort of the embodied footprint, and you mentioned CO2 equivalent emissions. And then you hinted at the fact that this is one aspect in a broader spectrum of things we need to assess, certainly from a sort of Earth system perspective, a planetary boundary perspective, with biodiversity loss, land use change, and so on, so on, so on. Could you maybe just talk briefly about whether this is being quantified, and what's the progress in quantification there? I think you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, great question. So I mean, for us, the IA, we focused mostly on the use phase, so on energy and greenhouse gas emissions. But yeah, there are researchers looking at the life cycle impacts. I think a lot of the research so far has been focused on devices. So for example, there's been papers from Ericsson looking at, they've taken apart smartphones and figured out the full life cycle analysis of a smartphone. you see some environmental footprint or environmental product information from companies like Apple, Fairphone. But in terms of comprehensive life cycle analysis from all these dimensions, I think they've typically focused mostly on devices, and there's definitely a lack of research, and I think more information is needed in that space in terms of also reducing the impacts as well. I mean, I tried to look for literature looking at the life cycle impacts of data centers, for example, and there's been very few, especially recently. There was a paper, in the mid, so 2013 to 2015, out of the US and the UK, kind of saying, the use phase is predominantly the largest impact in terms of energy and GHG. But I think as we go more and more towards decarbonizing data centers, there's probably going to be more interest in figuring out how to reduce both the carbon, but also the other environmental and health impacts of the hardware going into those systems. Especially because I think there's obviously to maintain efficiencies, these parts are going to be swapped out very quickly, 2 to 3, 4 year lifespans. I think right now there's some repurposing going on, but at some point there's going to be an end of life, and obviously more new devices coming in. So I think there's all these areas need much more research, but I think this is one in particular that will probably get increasing scrutiny over the next few years.
Yeah. Okay, Alonso, you have a question, I think.
Yep. Thank you so much, George, for the incredible talk. I wonder, when you go around the world giving these talks and talking to many people at different levels with different leverage in private sector and government, it's a really personal question I'm asking. So what gets at the bottom of your heart? What moves you? What type of frustrations do you go through? And you go like, man, I wish I would be the president of this country. Or what kind of personal challenges do you see that you go, this we should address right away?
I don't know. It's a great question. I think my biggest gripe with this topic has been, I don't know if it's misinformation or kind of headlines that are very kind of sensationalist, either both positively or negatively. So sometimes, you'll see headlines overstating the potential future footprint of ICT and, kind of fear mongering basically, and creates a business case for somebody to work on the efficiency side, or there might be environmentalists who have good intentions, but, look at this peer-reviewed paper and then say, but ICT is going to account for 1/5 of global electricity by 2030, even though, any kind of energy systems analyst would see that as not feasible in a realistic way. And I don't think that initial researcher intended it to be used that way, but that's how it's used, kind of to frame that. So the lack of good, robust estimates, I think, and I think the attraction of these kind of alarmist headlines is disheartening, because my biggest issue with that is that not that the footprint doesn't deserve attention. I think it does. I think we should be reducing those emissions and environmental impacts as much as possible. But I think it creates a false sense that if we, decarbonize data centers or the ICT sector, everything else is going to be okay. And it's not. Like, if we don't reach our climate goals, it's probably not because we didn't reduce the energy consumption of data centers from 1% to 0%, or for carbon emissions by 1.5% for the ICT sector at large to 0. It's going to be because we didn't invest in the right technologies to decarbonize these much harder to abate sectors like heavy industry and transportation. If you think about whether, it's a philosophical question about whether people are willing to adopt new behaviors, and, for example, not flying, which is a huge source of emissions on a personal level. If we choose to continue to fly into the future, to get that to 0 emissions for a cross-Atlantic flight, we don't have the technologies today. We can't electrify those planes right now. The energy density is not there. So we need to invest in technologies to allow that behavior to continue if that's what we want as a society. So I think focusing too much on the footprint, I think, distracts policymakers and the public from much more daunting challenges. So I think it's often not a bad intention. I think it's good to raise awareness, but obviously there's a prioritization and a limited amount of political capital that can be deployed. And if you start telling consumers, oh, you should reduce your Netflix bitrate to SD because that's going to save this much emissions, it's such a tiny drop in the pond. As a policymaker, I wouldn't focus on that. I would focus on the big ticket items, at least initially. Flying less, driving less, and then some of these are much more systemic as well. Like I mentioned the importance of the electricity grid and your overall emissions for digital services. We have very little control over that. Of course, you could sign up for a green tariff with your utility, but broadly speaking, the electricity grid is a very, it's a policy and a technology thing done by your utility and your governments. And these are much more transformational changes where I think individuals can have an impact more on the political and policy making side to have much bigger impacts to fight climate change. So I think I'm getting back to your question, I think I'm annoyed when it's focused too much on one thing. So they're so focused on the footprint of streaming video and ignore the bigger picture of how that fits in with other emissions. Or if conversely, you might see tech companies saying, oh, this ML and this data center service is going to decarbonize this sector by 10 times the footprint. And like I said, the comparing baselines is incredibly challenging. I think the true answer is somewhere in the middle, and we need to look at the net effects of digitalization. Obviously, some are going to be negative, some are going to be positive, and we need to drive the right uses of those technologies. Otherwise, I think it's just going to kind of exacerbate existing problems that we already have, and much like we've seen through the COVID crisis, like kind of making things worse in all directions. But yeah, great question. I hadn't really thought.
May I very briefly allowed to react to that answer?
Yeah, certainly.
Because I mean, it's a powerful point that you're making. All this idea about technology advancing towards a more sustainable future, and yet you see behavior in people going exactly the opposite way. Misinformation and disinformation both have been extensively studied in the past 2 years by the Center of Humane Technology. Sure, you came across their podcast already. But in any case, their last podcast, it's an interview, just very powerful with Daniel, I think, Daniel Schmachtenberger is his name. I truly encourage you to, and everyone, by the way, listening, because it's all about addressing complex problems in I don't want to say holistic, but in a fairly complex way as well, because his point is it agrees with you in that if you focus only in one single branch, you may end up breaking the tree rather than shifting. Well, thank you so much.
You can also put it in the chat, maybe for others, the link to the.
Sure, will do.
On that note, actually, it reminded me when you had the headlines, reduce your emails, reduce your streaming. It seemed very. The first thing I thought of, surely that's fossil fuel propaganda, putting the blame on the individual to act rather than systemic change. But on that note, in the vast majority of IPCC scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, they I think make two really crucial assumptions. One is this, as you hinted at, negative emissions technology that is nowhere near the development that is needed. But the second one, and maybe this is slightly more insidious, is this notion that we can decouple GDP growth or material use from emissions, right? So it's kind of So there's some really historically unprecedented rates of decoupling, and I'm wondering where do you stand in this? I browsed through the net zero report that you did, that the IEA did. They said, yeah, by 2050 we've doubled the economy, but we've reached net zero and so on and so forth. So where do you see? We could also just have like a huge transformation of society in terms of the demand side. don't do EVs, just let's not have cars, right? Invest in public transport and so on and so on. So I'm curious where you stand on this.
Yeah, I think it's a socio-political question, right? So I'll answer it on a personal basis, so based on my own views. But I mean, I think at least in the near term, the political feasibility, I guess, for climate action is there for a lot of countries, and I think you'll see companies, investing in EVs or infrastructure. I think can enable a pathway that at least avoids the lock-in of some of these very polluting infrastructures or cars. But yeah, longer term, I think, I think it's a difficult question about what the best pathway is to get there. I mean, the way I see it is that we can't really pick and choose what technologies are the right technologies or the right pathway. We just need to get on track with the possibility of a 1.5 degree future. So because in 2040 or 2050, if our emissions continue to stay quite high over the next decade, we won't even be asking the question about 1.5 or what negative emission technologies should we use or not use. Whether nuclear or renewables is the right one. We need to, because we have a lot of these technologies today in terms of decarbonizing electricity. We know how to decarbonize rapidly over the next decade. I think it's a political will question and a deployment and scale up question. I think getting to the net zero part in the 2040s, 2050s is going to be much more challenging. But obviously there's a global conversation and discussion around the equity around decarbonization between wealthy countries and countries that are developing, which I can't personally weigh in on, but because developed countries like the ones we live in have had the opportunity to emit carbon emissions and develop and provide sanitation and healthcare for citizens, but I think we have a huge role to play in trying to get countries who are developing now to avoid that pathway that we've built a car-centered infrastructure and societies, and I think that kind of lock-in would make the chances of meeting 1.5 impossible. So I think right now it's just like scaling up, just keeping the possibility open, I think, is really the priority. I mean, we could talk about systems level change, but in the event that is not possible or politically feasible, I think at least deploying all the renewables we can and low carbon technologies in the next decade, so that in 2030, if we have this chat in 10 years and we said, oh, net zero by 2050 is still possible. Like I wouldn't want to be in the situation where we were pressing for systemic change and actually didn't really achieve anything. In 2030, emissions were just as high, and now the possibility of reaching net zero was closed. So I think we need to just do everything at once. So scaling up, EVs, whatever it is, and then also pressing on behavioral change and systemic change at the same time. But yeah, if you ever get into a conversation, if anyone asks me like, oh, what technologies do you think is the right one for clean electricity, I just say, all of them. Like we can't really choose. Like we just need to do everything very quickly. It's not about decarbonizing this sector or the other sector, just all of them very quickly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's as you mentioned, there's a social justice element with, I think, a recent paper from last year reported that 85% of historical emissions were from the G8. So it's really a justice issue as well. I think there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah, maybe I can go through them quickly. So for Merzad, thanks for these questions. The data access and data availability issue is hugely challenging across the ICT sector. So it's not, compared to other sectors like transport, where we have a good understanding of like the cars that are sold and the fuel economy of those cars, the ICT sector, we have very little transparency around. So, I would encourage companies to be as transparent as possible, but of course it's highly competitive. And they, as you see more and more consolidation between these players, especially in data centers, there's only a couple big, data center providers, they don't really, I think, want to share that much data. They share the annual energy consumption data, obviously. So, you could see how much energy is going up over time, but in terms of efficiency metrics, or they do share PUE data on data center cooling efficiency. But yeah, it's this kind of lack of data makes it very difficult to validate some of the estimates that are coming out as well. I think with data centers, it's possible because there's only a few big players, and you can kind of add those up, assume something for smaller data centers, and then kind of match those with the modeled estimates from shipments of servers and networking equipment. But yeah, data is a huge challenge. And on the second question, applying a set of small. Yeah, so it's the optimization to reduce footprint. I think it's probably going to be driven by cost, right? So cost savings for these companies. Like there's the energy cost for these companies is big. It's a big share of OPEX. So they would probably have a lot of interest in reducing them. But in terms of systemic change, I don't think it's those are the ones that are going to trigger those. 3 asks from the community. Yeah, so as ML practitioners, I would say, learn as much as you can about the energy system, or whatever systems you want to reduce emissions from. So if it's agriculture, learn about where the emissions are coming from, and what are the challenges in reducing emissions. So because some of these sectors are quite complicated, and it's not just a simple ML model that's going to fix it. You need to apply in the right place. Maybe there are challenges around the data collection or data availability or data cleaning. So I think understanding the sectors you want to participate in, I think, are hugely important. And of course, trying to reduce your own footprint as well with shifting workloads across time and locations where it matches renewables and clean electricity. And then there's some questions from Rudo. Google searches. I don't think this is a big carbon emissions source, so I wouldn't worry too much about this. Of course, you could use other search engines, of course, but yeah, it's I think quite minuscule. So in terms of your own search impacts, it's quite small. I think they published some numbers before, but it's again like most of the energy is going to come from your device. So if you're on a laptop, maybe it's less than, of course, less than a desktop, but the wattage that your device is using, unless it's a smartphone, is going to be much larger than the energy being used either for data transmission or for the data center that's serving that function. So anyways, don't worry too much about the small things, I think. Because I think, digital technologies also enable a lot of information sharing and education, right? So you kind of need to balance these kind of footprint discussions with the benefits that you actually get. And Fabian, to your question earlier around GDP growth, digital, I guess, has a lot of potential to decouple, the energy use and GDP and carbon intensity kind of indicators, because there's a lot of potential for dematerialization. So if we are able to conduct this call like this versus us traveling to some location, even if you were all to take public transport, that's still probably going to use more emissions than if we were to all meet, and maybe I took a Thales to well, not right now, but from Paris to Amsterdam or something. But yeah, I think, but then again, there's this, so that's the direct effect, and then the indirect effect being the rebound effect of much more of these services being available and people using it. But again, it's like, if you don't do that, what else are you doing with that time? So if you aren't streaming, are you going to be reading a book instead, which is very emissions friendly? But if you choose to instead go out for a drive or do something, have a burger or something carbon intensive, it's not going to be doing the world any favors in terms of carbon. So it's, yeah, I think we should all just be doing everything we can with the knowledge that we have, and both at an individual level, but also kind of triggering systemic change. And our policymakers should be pushed as much as possible, because they're reacting to public sentiment, right? So we should be encouraging them to enact aggressive climate policies and not to be afraid of that. So
Anybody else have some questions? Bushra, you raised your hand.
Hi, it's Bushra. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much for the presentation. That was very insightful. I'm also specializing in energy transition in my master's, so it was quite interesting to listen to your intakes. So my question is about a little bit of digitalization, also on internet access, because I researched a bit on digitalization and internet access in general and within the global South. And it remains to me a very westernized discourse. For example, on what you mentioned on internet traffic. And when I worked in the past with World Bank data for research purposes, it highlighted that 35% of the world population have access to the internet compared to the 80% of developing countries, which still don't have access to it. And I want to ask you, as a policy analyst, do you think that we should make it a global process and a global policy instead of making it more on a micro level and planning our policies on a micro level? And since low-income countries are enduring consequences of the global north. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the kind of digital access is similar to the energy access challenges that the South has, the global South has. So at the IEA, we track energy access, to reach Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 to allow to have clean electricity access for all. And I think it's interesting that the progress in digital access is actually going up faster than electricity access, but I think there is probably potential for these to be paired. So I mentioned the mobile phone kind of business model that seems to be unlocking some, at least moderate electricity access, but of course that's not full electricity access. That might be charging, a phone and a few devices. It's not like the kind of electricity access that we enjoy in our homes. And I think that's where we need to go into the future. In terms of policy responses for this, I'll admit I'm not an expert on either electricity access or digital access, but I think we need to realize the incredible benefits that both of these energy and digital services bring to societies, and for this to be a priority. So, if you think of climate change, both, in terms of improving lives in these countries, both electricity and internet services could, have a huge impact on day-to-day lives, education, access to healthcare, these kind of critical services that everyone deserves. And I think, definitely we should be making this a priority in developing countries. But sorry, I don't know enough to answer this in more detail.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I have one. Because you mentioned data access, and I recently browsed through this global carbon budget 2020 paper and some articles on our world in data on electricity and renewables and so on and so on. And I found that they rely on data from BP, which is part of the gang that allowed climate inaction and funded climate inaction, rather than on data from the International Energy Agency, which I would expect the data to be used from. And then I browsed around on your website, and it costs money to access the data. I can check the World Energy Review. I think 12 months, one user, 800 euros. It struck me that must limit your reach quite substantially. So and being having been created by the OECD, rich countries, why is that an issue? Why is it not freely available? And are there steps being made to make it actually available?
So that's above my pay grade, but I personally, I think yeah, I think data should be freely available. But I think so in terms of our funding model, we have core budget that comes from countries, but actually a lot of our budget actually comes from voluntary contributions around certain projects. And the balance of that budget is from selling data and selling reports. So I think, it might partly be a budget question. If government contributed more, we could make up that shortfall. But I think there's a strategy right now in terms of rethinking of our own strategy about how to make data available to more researchers. Because we certainly benefit from data from other researchers as well. So yeah, I think in the coming years there will be a change in how we share and monetize data. But I think more and more of our reports have become free in the past few years. So and we're trying to publish more kind of commentaries and shorter analyses rather than long kind of books, because we find it's easier for people to access the key messages that way. And one of the projects that I manage, tracking clean energy progress, we make all our charts available for download. But yeah, I'll leave it there. But yeah, indeed, I think all organizations, should be making their data more and more available for researchers to use. Because yeah, that's probably the biggest barrier for researchers to access. But I think in terms of academic access, it might be easier. But anyways, it's being worked on internally.
Yeah, I'm going to lobby with some OECD countries to increase their budget, because this really is not good. Yeah. Are there any other questions from the audience? Because then I would have two last personal ones. So one is, again, browsing through your net zero report. One of the key milestones is to not plan any new coal and gas exploration by 2021. And then there was a recent Carbon Brief article on exactly that, with I think 432 new coal mines planned, most of them in Russia, China, India, in Australia. And occasionally I feel very good that we can make it, when it was Biden summit and so on and so on. But then you read these things, and as long as fossil fuels don't peak and decline, it's just talk. So I'm wondering, do you think, what's your take? Do you think there's going to be a massive carbon bubble, or are we actually going to have 3-degree warming by the end of the century?
So I didn't work on the net zero report personally, so I'm not involved in any of the kind of long-term energy modeling at the IEA. But yeah, it's a huge issue that we are trying to highlight more and more. So I was only able to touch on it briefly around the lock-in of infrastructure. But indeed, like everything from the supply of fossil fuels to the infrastructure that uses them, so the power plants that burn coal or the cars that burn gasoline and diesel, these are, like I said, decades-long infrastructures that will either cost a lot to phase out because of the upfront costs, or as you said, it's going to be contributing carbon emissions in 30 or 40 years, and we will be at 3 degrees or warmer. So I guess there's a lot of different players in this space, right? So I guess questions around who is funding the projects. Is it governments? Is it international development banks? Who do we target in terms of not financing these projects that pose risks to the climate, I think. But I'm slightly optimistic, in how the net zero report is being received, and that governments seem to be taking some of the message seriously. I saw a recent announcement out of Canada, where I'm from, about phasing out fossil fuel cars by 2035. No new fossil fuel cars. So, which is one of the milestones mentioned in the report. So, yeah, the infrastructure. Of course, there's a huge risk for stranded assets, and financial institutions, research institutions have highlighted this for years already. So, to me, it's the question of whether there is a gap between political ambition and targets, long-term targets. So, a lot of governments have announced net zero pledges to 2050, 2060, covering more than half of global emissions and GDP. But if companies, banks are lending and investing into these new fossil fuel projects, that to me tells the story that they don't take the government targets that seriously. So they don't think that those long-term targets will be followed up with actual policies and concrete policies that will reduce emissions. So we need to see governments, I think, immediately start enacting policies like this phase out of gasoline, diesel cars in Canada. We need to see these types of immediate policies that will signal to investors and to other countries that we are serious, governments are serious about climate change, because it's going to be extremely expensive to be investing in polluting infrastructure. So I think until that gap is narrowed, we might continue to see companies kind of doing the same. But I don't know, there's been a lot of, I think, progress in the last last year. I think, before Paris, maybe 6-7 years ago, if we would probably be pretty happy with where the world is, at least in terms of ambitions. Obviously there are different kind of ups and downs in terms of climate momentum throughout the world. But I'm slightly optimistic right now, the growing momentum around net zero and decarbonization in general. But yeah, both on the corporate side and governments, but we do need not just those kind of lofty, long-term goals, but actually here is, this efficiency standard that's going to reduce energy use in this sector. We need these, technologies, deployment targets, those kind of very concrete actions, not just to say, oh, as a company, we're going to be net zero by 2040, which, let's be honest, like by that time, these leaders are not going to be in power anymore. And it's going to be up to, younger generations to deliver. So yeah, it's really, how seriously are we taking these country and corporate commitments, I think will explain that gap between ambition and action.
Yeah, it's certainly what a time to be alive, no? I mean, really, this generation, really what we do now is going to influence centuries and millennia to come. I mean, it's really, yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. And especially with these transformative technologies, I think it's great that, you all from kind of a digital background are interested in climate and energy systems, because yeah, we should be using all the tools that we have available to reduce emissions. And I think digital seems to have a lot of potential if we use it in the right ways. So I'm very encouraged when there's always a discussion kind of across disciplines, because we can't just do what we've been doing, right?
Yeah.
Past few decades, like it's too slow to do that. So
yeah. So lastly, what's next for you? What are you working on? And what's
so well, I mean, I'll continue to track this digital energy space, digital energy climate space. We have a World Energy Outlook coming up in the fall, I guess, leading up to COP. So, and then a press which tries to map out kind of in the near term technologies are doing towards medium-term goals. So, there's 46 technology areas and sectors. Very few, I think 4, are currently rated as agreement goals, meaning that 42 are not on track. So it's a daunting challenge. And yeah, we need to see more policy progress, more technology advancement, deployment. But yeah, just some of the projects and the critical minerals as well. We'll continue to track that area, which is, I think, given the IEA's space historical role in energy security, I think it'll be the mineral side will become increasingly important as we transition from a fuel security perspective to, it's going to be more about materials and minerals, which poses both opportunities and challenges that are different from fuels. Because once you buy an EV, the materials are locked in, and you don't have to worry about the security of the fuel as much. But of course, if we're going to scale up EVs at the rate that governments are talking about, it's going to require a huge amount of lithium and nickel and copper and all that. So.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for joining us tonight. This was fantastic. Please send me your slides. I think one could teach a whole course based on them. Yeah, thanks again for joining, and yeah, I wish you all the best.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for the really great questions. That was very interesting.